Yes, I titled this talk Accessibility Convincing, and that is what it says on the title slide. It also has my name, has my website, which is lflegal.com, has my Twitter handle, which is at lflegal. And I'm a big believer in Twitter for accessibility community and accessibility learning and sharing. So I invite you, if you're not part of the Twitter accessibility community, really big plug for joining and using the conference hashtag if you want to say anything about these sessions. Yeah, so I got the idea for this session when I realized that I have done a lot of convincing about accessibility over the past 27 years. Usually in my visual description, which I'll give over now, I say, my name is Lainey Feingold and I'm a white woman. My most salient visual feature is the gray and white hair that those of you who can see can see. And I say that because I have been in the space since 1995. Also, my pronouns are she and her. And I realize no matter what role that y'all are in, you're convincing someone that they need to do accessibility. And my convincing mostly happened in the context of structured negotiation. For those of you who don't know me, it's a collaborative process to make sure that digital content technology is accessible using the law as a foundation, but without filing lawsuits. So when you file a lawsuit, a lot of the convincing is telling the judge how bad things are. But in a collaboration using the law, we're trying to convince the other side, not even the other side, I shouldn't even use that language. We're trying to convince the private company or the government agency of the value of accessibility. And for that reason, I feel like all the things that I've learned over these many years about convincing have application way beyond the legal system and to whatever your role is. So let's dive in. I thought I'd start with just a brief overview of my 27 years of convincing. I have the stopwatch on, so I might have to speed up along the way. So yeah, 27 years of convincing. My convincing work around accessible tech started with working on talking ATMs. When blind people came to me and my colleagues in the mid-90s, when there wasn't a single ATM that blind people could use. The image I have here is of a cake in the shape of a talking ATM. It's very yummy looking. It has thick white frosting. It has an audio jack and darker frosting with an actual earphone plugged in. It says audio jack and purple frosting with an arrow and a picture of a headset with a red circle around it. This was a cake in the background. You can kind of read Talking ATM Cake from Virginia Bakery. It's a cake I had made for the launch of my book, which I first wrote in 2016 and then did an update in second edition in 2021. And the book really has a lot of convincing stories too. And I'm thinking, well, maybe I should have had a real picture of a talking ATM for y'all, but I'm thinking convincing with collaboration and using tools really intended to have people be convinced is kind of sweet. So I feel like the cake is a good picture. What happened with the talking ATMs is we work with blind people. It was my first lesson in always, always, always. You'll hear this throughout this talk, listening, incorporating, valuing, putting front and center people with disabilities in our work. And towards the end, we got the talking ATMs. We never filed a lawsuit. We worked with Bank of America, Citibank, and Wells Fargo. We got some of the early talking ATMs. And then towards the end, some of you may have heard me say this before, some of our blind clients who were very much more tech savvy than I am. I see some friends on this list who know my limitations and how much I know about tech. They came to us and they said, well, Lainey, good job. You know, this collaboration got us talking ATMs, but there's a new thing called online banking. And if we don't make that accessible, then we're going to be back to square one, not having access to our own money. So we went to Bank America, and because we had the relationship, it's another word you heard me say throughout, because we had the relationship of collaboration that we had built when working on talking ATMs, when we said to Bank America, there's this new thing. It wasn't new to them, but hardly anybody was using online banking at the time. It was like 1998. And the bank said, yeah, let's sit down and figure it out. And as a result of that, in 2000 was the first web accessibility agreement in the United States between Bank America's blind customers and Bank America, who has continued to be a champion around accessibility. So that led to a lot of convincing with a lot of different organizations around web accessibility. I should say that it wasn't just that our blind clients, Roger Peterson, Jerry Coons in particular, had a vague idea about online banking, but they actually had, I could call them contraptions, Rube Goldberg things where they would communicate with the bank by typing, and the bank would send something back and it would print out in Braille. So they really knew what it was going to be like. They had the foresight to know what it was going to be like when things like banking were online. And that is really the only reason that I can get up and say I helped negotiate the very first web accessibility agreement 22 years ago. So that first Bank of America web case led to many other, lots of web accessibility convincing. We work with, like I said, B of A, Major League Baseball, Denny's, Albertsons, Charles Schwab, Houston Transit, Weight Watchers, more recently Discord and Patreon, and all of this without lawsuits, with bringing people with disabilities front and center and helping these organizations realize the importance of web accessibility. So that led to other kinds of convincing around accessible tech. We worked on tucking prescription labels. There's an image here of a billboard in an airport from CVS Health that says, "For those who can't see, pill bottles that talk." And that was several years ago, just this summer, again, as part of the relationship. CVS expanded their talking label initiative, and now they're the only major pharmacy that has it built right into the mainstream app. So we work with CVS and Walmart, Humana, Walgreens. We work with Anthem on Braille healthcare statements. We work with San Francisco on APS. If you're interested in these kinds of things, on my website, there's a high-level navigation for topics, and you can read more about all these efforts. So out of this and thinking about this talk, I came up with a list of convincing do's, things that I think that have helped me and my clients in my work, and can also help you in whatever type of convincing that you're doing. So the first one is, do involve disabled people. If you're listening and are a disabled person, do involve yourself. If you're not, always be mindful. That's another thing about convincing. It doesn't just happen, like most things. We have to be mindful of what we're doing, what is our goal of digital inclusion, and how can we best convince the people we're talking to that it's the right thing for them to do. So do involve disabled people for a couple of reasons. Obviously, expertise and relationship. Really want to emphasize the relationship piece here. And I have a picture of Kathy Skivers. She was an activist, national blind advocate based in California. She died a couple of years ago in her 90s. She was an advocate till the very end. And she was involved. She was head of the California Council of the Blind when we did the Talking ATM case in negotiations. Kathy made no bones about the fact that she was never going to use a talking ATM. She didn't like technology. She was never going to use a website, but she knew, because she was a good organizer, that blind people would want to and need to use a technology. And I bring it up here because as part of those negotiations, we ended up in a mediation. The mediator was also an older guy who didn't use an ATM. I know it seems hard to believe now. Didn't use a website, wasn't going to, and he really bonded with Kathy Skivers. So the relationship element of convincing can't really be overstated, because we want to do things for people we know, and we have the opportunity to help the organizations we're working with know disabled people so they can understand the barriers that we're talking about. Involving disabled people for their knowledge base and for empathy. And by empathy, I don't mean sympathy. I mean empathy in understanding what it's like to experience barriers when people don't embrace accessibility, when they don't keep web accessibility in mind. Here's just a couple people. This is Brian Charlson, who's a blind technology expert, key to the negotiation with Major League Baseball. Why? Because he is a baseball fan. And so are the MLB people. And when we got everybody on a phone call, I was like, okay, I'm not needed here. Yes, I'm the lawyer. Yes, I could create this meeting. And we'll talk in a minute how you can create these meetings. But the relationship that Brian and the whole team of blind baseball fans that we brought together were able to forge with Major League Baseball was really the ticket of the success. You know, structured negotiations, since I wrote a book and I'm a public speaker, it tends to be sometimes thought of as, you know, a legal strategy, and it is a legal strategy and something that I helped co-create, and I did help co-create, but sometimes gets lost in that story is all the blind people without whom none of it would have happened. And so a few other people, this picture here is a group of lawyers and San Francisco traffic engineers and blind pedestrians in San Francisco, where we used to meet like every 3 months. This, I think, was our last meeting. Everybody's smiling. Again, the relationship that was forged and the ability of the San Francisco traffic engineers to meet blind people who could get hurt on the streets if they didn't have accessible signals. That was the ticket. This is Vita Zavali. We worked on tactile keypads to make sure blind people didn't have to share their pins. And we'd go to stores and we'd have people like Vita. There was a whole group of blind people. And just as an aside, everyone whose picture I'm using has given me permission to use the picture and tell their story. And, you know, people could see what it was like to have to pay for products when you couldn't enter your own ATM card, or you couldn't get your own cash back and you had to share it with the retailer. Kit Lau over here was the brains and genius behind negotiation with Charles Schwab. That case worked because we had a big meeting with all the Schwab people, and Kit is an options trader who was doing everything with her braille display and her JAWS. We had a big screen up so that Charles Schwab people could see, hey, what is it like for Kit Lau to trade options on our website? And that was a ticket. And then Kim Charlson is another blind activist nationally, helped with the talking prescription labels. I should say led the talking prescription labels. I was thinking, well, everybody talks about at scale, like how do we do things at scale? How can one meeting with one disabled person or a group of disabled person, how does that really scale in a company? And that reminded me, we do want to do work that scales. And I think these individual meetings in terms of convincing enables us to scale. And I have a picture here of Lori Gray, who's involved in the negotiation with the credit reporting companies around her need for audio because she couldn't read Braille because she had neuropathy and she couldn't use a computer at the time. And in my book, I have a quote that I just want to read you really quick from one of the lawyers for the credit reporting companies who said, disability awareness is now in the DNA of our company, in part because we remember dealing with your clients. I remember Lori Gray, whose picture is up here with her signature cowboy hat on. I remember Lori Gray, who couldn't use Braille and needed audio format. I will never forget her, and I've often told the story of that meeting to others in the company, and they will never forget her either. So I don't think we should underestimate the power of single meetings. I've had so many. There's so many stories like that I could tell you. So it's my view that people with disabilities bring the why to the convincing, and the best why there is. Yes, we'll talk about some other whys later. But you don't have to wait for a legal claim. So some ideas that I have seen work in other contexts, you don't have to wait for a lawyer. You don't need a structured negotiation or an ethical lawsuit. Number one, hire people with disabilities. Make sure disabled people are integral to the entire company to the extent you're able, whatever power you have in hiring or sharing the importance of hiring. That's important. Hire disabled consultants. Bring in a disabled speaker. Amazing how powerful it can be just to have somebody speak who uses technology and faces barriers. And, you know, we have to remember, many of us live and breathe this stuff. Most people don't. So when they see someone using a Braille display or using JAWS or navigating without a mouse or not being able to hear a video, it is very impactful. Encourage self-identification if you're in an organization. That helps bring out more people with disabilities to the conversation. Arrange demos, like I said, been very powerful. Begin a conversation. Begin a conversation. Many accessibility efforts in large companies start with the employee resource groups and bringing their pain points to the organization. Brown bag lunches, informal, everything doesn't have to be super structured. We're going to do this first, and then we're going to do that. We're trying to find opportunities for relationship building, I think, is a key convincing element. And partnering with a disability rights organization, Also important. So that's number one, involving people with disabilities throughout the process. Number two, talk about the law as a civil right. Talk about the law as a civil right. As you know, there's a lot of stuff going on in the legal space right now. We'll sort of touch on it. This is not a legal update, but many of you know my feelings that not everybody using the law in the web space is treating the law as a civil right. Not all the lawyers, not all the plaintiffs, but we can. We can talk about the law as a civil right. I love this quote from Lizzie Kiama, as a Kenyan disability activist, who said, "The legal framework gives us permission to dream what is possible." The legal framework gives us permission to dream what is possible. We have that framework here in the United States. You know, we can go off and worry about when there'll be regulations and when there won't be, but we have the Americans with Disabilities Act passed 32 years ago, thanks to organizing efforts of disabled people. And that has made my work possible, even though I don't do lawsuits. It's made the majority of cases that are ethical come out successful. So we have permission to dream what is possible with the legal framework we have. Also important to remember, in the convincing, law gives rights to people. It's not some random thing written on a piece of paper in a book or digitally. Blind workers can't check their vacation time. Deaf learners can't access podcasts. Blind campers can't make a parks reservation for their vacation. Deaf gamers can't play in virtual reality. There are now cases pending on all these things. Usually I don't see them talked about in that way. We usually hear about, you know, some famous movie star has been sued for not having web access, or we just get the quick, someone got a lawsuit, this person got a lawsuit. But the law gives rights to people. So the civil rights aspect of accessibility in terms of convincer is very much tied to making sure disabled people are front and center. Convince in the language of civil rights. This is a picture of a very closed door. It has a key lock, it has a padlock, it's old, it looks like it hasn't been opened in decades, it's kind of blue chip paint. The language of civil rights is inclusion and exclusion. We can't lose sight of that when we're trying to convince people of what this whole thing is all about. Should people with disabilities be included, or should they be excluded? If you can't hear, do you really have to miss the podcast and the video? If you can't see, do you really have to share your confidential information with somebody else? So convincing in the language of civil rights, participation versus denial of participation, equity versus discrimination. People with disabilities, talking about people with disabilities. You may have noticed I use the phrase people with disabilities and disabled people interchangeably. I really can recommend to you Emily Ladau's book that just celebrated its year anniversary, whose name is escaping me. Maybe somebody can put it in the chat. But it's a great book, and it talks about language. And of course, when you're one-on-one, you want the preference of the person you're talking to. In this kind of talk, where we have a lot of people here, I do interchangeable because some people prefer disabled people, some people prefer people with disabilities. Plaintiffs versus customers. The word plaintiffs comes from a French root that means wretched complainer. Wretched complainer. I believe in civil rights lawsuits. I've been lucky to be able to do collaboration instead of lawsuits, but there's very many ethical lawsuits and ethical lawyers doing them. But this word plaintiffs comes from a root of wretched complainer. So who wants to talk about plaintiffs, or do you want to talk about customers and employees and applicants? You want to talk about people. When in doubt, talk about people. We want to talk about somebody suing something or someone needing information. So convince in the language of civil rights. And again, it's all about intention. You may think, oh, they're not going to care whether I talk about civil rights or not, but you're going to care. You're going to care, and it's going to help shape your power to convince who needs convincing. Keep current with the legal space. I'm, of course, for it. I'm a lawyer. I do the legal updates for the community because I think people want to know. Understand the ADA as a foundation of disability inclusion in the United States. Understand your country's framework if you're not from the United States. Understand the status of ADA regulations. True, we don't have Title III regulations. We have a promise of Title II regulations next year, state and local government. But all the cases that are being won and all the advocacy and all the work is being done with a legal framework that doesn't have regulations. So don't get too, I want regulations. I think we need them, but we don't need them for our convincing, except to say, yeah, I'm sorry we don't have regulations. I know it would make your job easier, but we have a law for 32 years requiring inclusion. And if our digital isn't inclusion, it's just like having steps to the building. And understand the lawsuit numbers. I don't want to go into a big thing about the lawsuit numbers. Those of you who've heard me talk have heard me say I'm not that interested in the numbers because the numbers create fear, and a lot of those cases are not what I consider ethical cases. I have gotten some very respectful feedback about, well, my company, all they care about is the numbers. So I say convince with the numbers, but not only, because you don't want a restrictive response. Oh, there's a lawsuit, 4,000 lawsuits, we better get an overlay. That is not the answer that we want. That is a terrible answer. If you're not familiar with the overlay issue, you can go to overlayfactsheet.com. We don't have time to get into that here, but I encourage you to read what is posted in that overlayfactsheet.com. I've written about it, and we have to be able to talk about the law in a way that's not full of fear. So in my legal update tab, I try to do that. I try to write for people who aren't lawyers, all of you. Well, not all of you, there's probably some lawyers in the room, but you know what I mean. And I put the articles in the legal update tab, so you can look for them there. I use Twitter. It's faster for me to put something out on Twitter than to write an article. So if you really want to keep up with what I know about the law, which of course is not everything, you can follow me on Twitter at LF Legal. Number 3, understand who you are convincing. This is super important because not everybody responds to the same kinds of things. So you have to know who you're talking to. And like I said at the top, sometimes you're talking to a person and you want to convince them as a person. Sometimes you're talking to the company. Sometimes you're talking to a part of the company. You might be in accessibility and you have to convince HR, vice versa. So I like, yeah, I said that here. You are convincing a person and an organization or part of an organization. I like this picture. This is a picture of a cat looking in a mirror and seeing a lion. And I like this because it's like everybody does that, whether we're an individual or a company. We see ourselves in a certain light. This little kitty cat is looking in the mirror and seeing a lion. So we have to know who we are talking to and how they see themselves. That is part of our convincing. What do they care about? How do they see themselves? What are their values? Now that we have the internet, I used to try to figure this out early on, writing letters without big websites, but now we can go to any website and find, what does this company care about? And who are their competitors? Because nobody it's one thing for us as advocates or whatever our role to convince. It's another thing to find out your competitors are doing something. Always good to know, who do they think of as their competitors and how does accessibility fit in? I put that in my contrast color here, which is celery green against a blue background. I have to thank Natalie McLeese, my web developer, for these nice slides. How does accessibility fit in to how a company sees themselves or how an organization, nonprofit, and some of you are inside organizations, so so you can answer these questions. What do they care about? And use that in your convincing. So some examples of that. The first one is accessibility fits for anyone who cares about security and privacy. And everybody cares about security and privacy. So our job should be easy because it's kind of like accessibility is hidden in security and privacy, and we have to let it out into the open. Because if systems are designed for closed, secure, independent use, and they're not accessible, then security and privacy is broken for the disabled person who has to share a credit card, who has to get help in filling out a form. I put a picture here of Kathy Martinez. Many of you know her. She's an advocate. She's worked in the private and the nonprofit sector. She was in the Obama administration. And she was also involved in the early talking ATM cases, which is why I have the picture of the audio jack talking ATM that was the inspiration for the cake at the top of the talk. Hearing from Kathy and the other advocates that they couldn't get $20 of their own money without sharing their PIN that was light bulbs off. I still hear from some of those banking people 20 years later. That was so impactful hearing about the privacy ramifications. And that was kind of before all of us were so caught up in privacy issues. So however someone thinks about themselves, they care about privacy. Let's make accessibility part of the privacy conversation. Accessibility fits for people who care about safety. This is a picture of Jerry Coons, who was involved in the accessible pedestrian signal case, trying out one of the signals that we got installed in San Francisco. I use that because the traffic engineers, when we first asked for talking, they were not talking, but they were audio. When you press a button, they did a rapid tick for when it was safe to cross the street. The traffic engineers were afraid that a blind person might mishear, step into the street and get hurt. Now, if we were in a traditional argument kind of convincing, we'd be telling a judge, that's ridiculous. Now they're not offering any sound. How could it be worse to offer some sound? Same with the pharmacists. They were afraid if they put talking labels on the prescriptions, then some blind people might mishear, take the wrong medication, and get sick or worse. So we were able to convince with their language, their people who cared about safety. And once we explained that, hey, you know what most blind people have to do before we had success with the talking prescription labels? They had to put rubber bands around the pill bottles and keep one in the bathroom, one in the kitchen, just to keep things straight. When you tell that to the pharmacist and speak in their language about safety, they got it. So accessibility fits for anyone who sees themselves, and safety is also a digital word too. Digital decision makers, developers, designers. We have to fit the word accessibility into all these things. Another one is accessibility fits for people who care about competition. They have a cute little picture of two young children on a go-kart race, and the one who's winning has his hand up in the air. Everybody cares about competition. So you got to know what the competitors are doing or what best practices. Who has an accessibility statement? Who's been recognized by a nonprofit? What about advertising accessibility? I mean, it's amazing now. We see these big companies like Microsoft advertising the Xbox gamer, Google advertising, national advertising during big prime events on the captioning that they offer. We know all this stuff. We have to fit these things we know into our convincing arguments because companies want to know what best practice are. They may not want to be the first out of the box, first off on the go-kart, but they want to know. So that's part of it. Who's speaking about accessibility at conferences? Follow the accessibility leaders on LinkedIn and share what they say. There's amazing accessibility work being done in big companies. I do consulting, and one of the organizations I consult with is Disability In, so I have a chance to really get to know some of the leaders in the accessibility space in the corporate side of things. And I mean, there's so many good people in corporate now that just couldn't have been imagined 27 years ago. I got to be honest with you. And so us sharing that with the people we're trying to convince, I think is important. And accessibility fits for people who care about the business case. Business case is more than money, even though money is a big part, and I have a bunch of $100 bills in the image, but there's starting to be, there's a lot of stuff on disability inclusion, good for the business case. There's starting to be more on accessibility as good for inclusion. Barclays did a good talk at TechShare. I'll put this in the slides when I give the information to the conference so you can see it. Accenture has a good report on accessibility and its value to the business case. So this, again, understanding how people think of themselves and showing how our issues fit in. Other ways, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. It's a topic right now, and accessibility is so essential to that for two reasons. First, of course, disabled people are part of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, but also disability is cross-cutting, and not all disabled people are white. So any company that cares about bringing in Black employees and people of color and Indigenous people and Asian people, some of those people are going to need accessibility because they're Asian and disabled, they're Black and disabled. So we can use the language of diversity, equity, and inclusion that most organizations, many organizations are already committed to bring accessibility to the forefront. Generosity, community partner, do your research. Many organizations do good work in other aspects of disability inclusion, even while falling short on accessibility. We once wrote a letter to a finance company and we said right up at the front, you're really generous. Your foundation gives money to disabled organizations. Accessibility is part of that continuum. Understanding how they see themselves. In a traditional lawyer setting, you can't really say nice things about the person that you're suing. It's kind of not allowed. But in the work that you're doing, convincing without any legal claim, or the work that I do with structured negotiation, it's entirely possible. So the last one is information delivery. I have a picture here of Sue Amater, who died a couple of years ago of cancer and was a big ACB activist. When she first got her diagnosis about 5 years before she died, she wanted information from the American Cancer Society. They didn't have anything for blind people. They had no audio, they had no braille, they had no accessible website. Maybe they had one thing. And we were able to say, hey, how do you see yourselves, American Cancer Society? When you look in that mirror, what do you see? You see an organization who wants to give information out in so many different languages. And that's more and more common. And so with Sue and the other blind activists who had cancer, we were able to say, providing accessible information to blind people is just like providing information to people in other who don't speak English. And we've been able to use that in a couple different instances to do the convincing using how they see themselves in that way. So when convincing, just to summarize, speak the language. They care about safety. Access is safety for medication. Web developers care about security. Access is security. Access is security. It's not adjacent. What do they say? Security adjacent. It is security. It is privacy. Bankers care about privacy. Access is privacy. Procurement teams care about avoiding future problems. Accessibility and RFPs avoid future headaches. HR cares about employees and system. Accessibility saves time. Yesterday, Disability In announced the business-to-business initiative around accessible procurement. I invite you to check that out. And that's why I thought of this thing about procurement teams, because a lot of it is education. A lot of it is showing procurement teams how accessibility fits into what they're already doing in terms of delivering compliant products. Number 4, convince with ethics. Convince with ethics. I'm a big believer. I'm not just a big believer in ethics, which I am, but I'm a big believer in us talking about ethics. Accessibility is ethics because it's inclusion and participation. It's civil rights and human rights. All the sort of ethical buzzwords fit into our issues. It's accountability, it's transparency, being honest about what works and what doesn't. It's about trust and not, making a disabled person disclose their assistive technology use without whatever. So all these issues, accountability, transparency, trust, accessibility is fundamentally a good thing to do. I'm embarrassed. I took that quote from somewhere and I want to tell you where it was from, but I forgot where it's from. So my apologies. If I figure it out, I'll put it in the notes. If it was you, please put it in the chat. ESG, environment, social governance, the hot new buzzword around accessibility, around ethics for investing. We're part of the S and the G. We're probably part of the E too. Social is DEI and human rights. That's people with disabilities. That's accessibility. Governance is security, privacy, and legal compliance. Again, we're already there. When we're convincing, it's our job to show how we're already there. Do tell a good story. Accessibility story components. I did put 3 pictures of 3 books by disabled authors. One is Haben Girma's book called Haben, the Deafblind Woman Who Conquered Harvard Law. One is Alice Wong's new book that just came out this week called Year of the Tiger. And the other is by Kia Brown, is a children's book called Sam Supersedes. I decided to put these on because we have to be storytellers too. And, I try to read everything that comes out by disabled authors like this because it helps me be a better storyteller and it reminds us what we're trying to communicate. So accessible story components, you got to know your audience. You got to know how they see themselves in the mirror. You got to know who your storyteller is and what they bring. So having people with disabilities as part of the storytelling. Impact on the disabled people of the barriers, not just consumers. I put creators here first because too often in our conversations that gets lost. creators, consumers, employees from hire to retire, civil rights, inclusion, exclusion, all part of the story components, and of course, ethics, like I just said. The story is the why, and these are some of the things that I think really make a compelling why. And always, this is not a number. This is not number 4 or 5. Always convince with kindness, convince with kindness. And, once I did a talk and someone said, well, we're talking about civil rights. Like, how can you be patient? How can you be kind? And to me, it's all strategy. It's all what is going to work best for getting people to move on our issues, to move the needle. And people kind of like people who are kind. And we'll talk about the don'ts, what people don't like, but there's no reason for us to, well, I don't believe anger is effective. I know some people do, so I don't want to say it as an objective statement. For me, it's been effective to be kind as a strategy. The quality of being friendly, generous, and considerate, and tied to accessibility, being realistic, taking small steps. In my view, starting with the audit has real risk. Starting with a user journey and a disabled person in a meeting, informally showing exactly what the experience is, much more convincing. Being realistic, taking small steps, handling misconceptions with facts instead of anger, using the language of encouragement. People like to be celebrated. People want to be encouraged. Having active patience. People wonder why I always talk about patience. I love patience, and I call it active patience, not just sitting around doing nothing. It's understanding that things take time. And if we don't allow for that time, if we don't bite off small chunks and celebrate the small steps to get to the bigger steps, we're going to have a problem. I got this idea from Rumi, who was born 800 years ago in the 1200s, Persian poet. Patience is not sitting and waiting. It is foreseeing. It is looking at the thorn and seeing the rose. It is looking at the night and seeing the day. That's our job in convincing. It's looking at the small step that's going to lead to big results. So, I think I had one more on there, but, and celebrating achievement. I said that. Okay. Okay. To summarize, here are the do's. We have a few minutes to do the don'ts. Do involve disabled people. Do understand who you are convincing and speak their language. Do talk about the law as a civil right. Do use the E word, ethics, all capital here. Do tell a good story, and do convince with kindness. Of course, talk like this would be incomplete without the convincing don'ts. So a few things I have learned along the way is don't shout. This is an image of 2 children dressed up as businessmen, and one is a white little boy shouting through a megaphone at a black little boy dressed in his business clothes who is completely, not showing emotion. And that is equanimity, being able to hear what comes at us. And we're going to hear things we don't like. It's too expensive. We can't do it. We'll do it next time. We can't get riled by that stuff. We just have to hear it. We have to stay calm, like this boy's picture. We can't shout. And we have to do the things that will make the organizations realize, hey, if we wait, that means people will be excluded. That means there might be a legal case. That means all the other things. Don't shout, big red X on that. Don't threaten. 2 white businessmen, one's pulling the tie of the other. So much threatening goes on, subtle and not subtle, in our space. The overlay company ads, the drive-by lawyer cases, many ways in which people write about the cases. I don't feel like people want to do things when they're threatened. And I use a touchstone, like if you wouldn't do it with your neighbor or in your spiritual community or in your family or in your friendship group, might not work in the context of accessibility. Big red X there. Don't reduce accessibility to a checklist. Big red X there. I think we all know that. Particularly important on convincing, because if we don't convince to bake in accessibility, tomorrow there's going to be a new thing we have to convince about. We can't just focus on a checklist of WCAG requirements. Don't be a shark. I said I use the dolphins. I hope I explained that at the beginning, that I used, maybe I didn't. There's a background of a dolphin. This is playing the Jaws theme song. nobody likes a shark. Like if I were to ask you right now, put in the chat, if I say shark, what's the first word that comes to mind? If anybody wants to do that, I'll take a look. We don't have to be sharks, even though what we want is civil rights, we want inclusion, we want human rights, we want compliance with the law. We still don't have to be a shark. And we don't have to act like a shark. This is my favorite little goldfish picture with a shark fin on it, because many of us, and I sometimes fall into this, and I used to be like this when I was younger. We don't have to be. We don't have to be. We have to stick. The facts are on our side. The principles are on our side. The ethics are on our side. We just have to learn to channel them in good convincing. So don't be a shark. Instead, always be a dolphin. You can see the background with the dolphins jumping. This is two cute dolphins with very cute dolphin sounds, like they're little like chirpy sounds that sound so much better than the Jaws theme song. These two dolphins are working together on a plastic container to take food out of. It's a National Geographic experiment if you want to try it. I mean, not try it. If you want to read about it, you can find it. If they don't work together, they don't get the food. And it's kind of that way with accessibility. We have to be collaborative. We have to, in my experience, make people feel that they want to do it. They want to do it for the right reasons. They want to do it for people who they respect, people who are ethical, people who they form relationship with. So always be a dolphin, and do stay in touch. On the final page, I have, again, my Twitter is at LF Legal, my website, lflegal.com. You can read about the book, my speaking and training opportunities, consulting, cases I do. And my email is lf@lflegal. And there's an image of the second edition of the book with a coffee cup in front of it. I think I left a few minutes for questions. How'd I do?
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Lainey. Yep, we have about 10 minutes for questions. Real quick before I ask them, somebody asked just, I think you mentioned you're going to share the slideshow. Is that correct?
I will. I can't do it today because I want to take the notes out of it, and I'll put in some resources. I'll just read before you go to the question. Like when I say shark, what do people think? Eeks. Like we don't want people to say that when we talk about accessibility. We want them to feel warm and fuzzy to the extent we can. And we have a hard job because of all the noise from the lawsuits and the overlay companies. Teeth, Shark Tank, attack, teeth, fear and oppression. Hi, Jen. Fear and oppression. Yeah. And now if I said dolphin, you could put those in too, because I'm sure dolphin, especially with that cute sound, might elicit something else. So what do we got for questions?
Okay, so this is from Corb. In a structured negotiation, can plaintiffs still get their legal expenses paid by the defendant?
The answer to that is yes. The answer to that is yes. The way the ADA works in a lawsuit is 50 years ago. I always try to say this because, because we have a certain kind of lawyer in the space, everyone thinks, oh, lawyers are just in it to make money. But the truth is, every civil rights law, the ADA, laws prohibiting race discrimination, gender, they have what they call fee shifting. In the United States, usually you have to pay for your own lawyer. But for discrimination cases, the obligation to pay shifts to the one who's been found to be discriminatory. Now, in our cases, we're lucky because we don't have to identify wrongdoers. We don't have to, in fact, most of our agreements, which I try to be very transparent, there's a settlement tab on my website. You can read many of the agreements I mentioned. We always say, I forget what they call it, but a non-admission of liability. No one's saying anyone did anything wrong, but negotiating over the attorney's fees is part of the final settlement. Usually that's in a private confidential agreement. Under the ADA, individual disabled people don't have a right to get damages. However, many state laws do have that right. California, for example, New York, Florida. So we do get money for or it's a topic of negotiation for our clients when the money is allowed. The key thing about structured negotiation, and I have always, checked myself for 27 years, maybe some of you know Eve Hill or Dan Goldstein, who's now retired, but phenomenal lawyers in the space who tend to do more lawsuits. And I was always checking, like nothing about collaboration can in any way limit the rights and the relief, the potential improvements that we get for our clients. So I feel pretty confident. I'm not saying every single case we, knocked it out of the park, but yeah, the short answer is yes. We'd get the same exact relief we'd get if there was a lawsuit, because you know what? Most lawsuits settle anyways. What happens with us is that we're able to form relationship without all the negative, bad stuff before we get to the table, which I think really helps.
Awesome. That's great. So do you have any advice for making progress on each step and mobilizing resources once key stakeholders have been convinced?
Say it one more time.
So do you have any advice for making progress on each step and mobilizing resources once key stakeholders have been convinced? So once you've convinced the key
yes. Yeah, that's kind of another whole talk. I do believe in starting out with a small step that can be achieved and celebrated, like I said. So, you can look at our agreements and, you're all in a better position because, when there's agreements like I've negotiated, there's a lot of lawyers involved from all sides. But when you can be collaborating outside of the legal system, like I did want to read, and I forgot a quote I have in the book from Josh Kim, who's a designer in the government space. And he said, before reading your book, I felt the only way to get a point across was to focus on winning by means of individual merit as opposed to collaboration. This shaped the language I use, and it also made me miserable. But reading your book changed, I don't want to say reading, he said reading your book, but employing these strategies, especially the kindness ones, not putting folks on the defensive, using persistent and positively framed language, avoiding military metaphors and vocabulary, etc., sticking to facts without over dramatizing, modeling trust, all those things will kind of naturally lead you to the next steps. And there's many things we're all convincing around. You may be convincing around an employment, technology used for applicants, or you may be trying to talk to procurement, or you may be a customer trying to, so it really depends. But I really think that was when I had to stop by no matter what. So I'm glad I stopped a little early. I think it's very important in collaboration and in convincing for everybody to feel they're around the table. So even if you think you know the right thing to do first, like first we have to do this, I would present it in a way like, I'm thinking maybe that the first thing we should do is get everyone together in a room and see how a blind person navigates the registration page. What do you think of that idea? And then people don't feel, nobody likes to have anything shoved down their throat. I should have put that on the kindness slide. No one likes it. Oh, they're telling me what to do, but you can phrase it. Jamie Knight, who many of you know, who is an accessibility technologist in London, he put on Facebook, on some social media, this really good idea. Like before he tells anybody anything, he asks them, do you want to hear it? So that's like I've been using that with other people in my family, like, oh, I have an idea for how we might start this relationship. Do you want to hear it? And then they'll say yes, and they can't kind of get mad at you because you told them that they told you wanted to hear it. Also, it doesn't all have to happen at once. So it's not like you have to lay out every single thing, because this is all also about culture shift. Because if we don't, this is a web accessibility conference, and there's mobile, and there's kiosks, and then there's XR, and there's Web3. And if we don't shift the culture with our convincing, which is why I don't like fear, then we're starting over from scratch every single new piece of technology.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So right now in the chat, there's kind of like a follow-up to what you're saying. They actually did it before you said it, but they're saying, so because you made the comment about let's skip the checklist. And so their comment is like they find they often skip the checklist, or other people do. So they're like, what kind of questions or hints are broad enough but specific enough to get developers to consider the UI they're working on from the perspective of user with a disability, like without the checklist?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm pretty sure you've had talks even during this conference about how to shift left enough to And, I'm not a designer, I'm not a developer, but what I have seen work, again, like I'm thinking of that Charles Schwab case and bringing Kit Lau into the room. I mean, it's hard to do a talk because you're kind of having to have little sound bites for really complex questions. So, it's not that a checklist is inherently bad. It's just can't be the only, and it can't be the first. So that understanding at the very beginning of who your audience is, who your users are, and taking it from there with some of these strategies about bringing in disabled people. And it's amazing what people will think of on their own. Once people get what this is really about, I have found really good adoption of it. And if we can stay calm in the face of people saying stuff we don't like, I think it's doable. But that's a really good question. I think it's another whole talk.
And I think, getting it into your culture, like you were just mentioning. So we have a legal question here. It's if like an organization such as a library, university, can claim that it's not their fault or responsibility if they use a third-party service that is not accessible. And they give examples of Hoopla, Overdrive, things like that.
Yeah, that third party question is a very good one. And I actually have a list of cases that I want to write up in plain language for people, because the ADA says that you can't discriminate big picture kind of directly or through contract and licensing. So the ADA from 32 years ago already understands that the school, and this happens in the private sector too, will not do everything themselves. Now, everybody's buying everything, but the ADA has a foundation for that. Our agreements have some third-party language. You can look at it. There's a limit to what we can do, either in a lawsuit or in a collaboration, which is why I like this Procure Access initiative from Disability In. You can look it up at disabilityin.org, what we do. And it just was launched this week after other efforts, because procurement accessibility is a culture shift too. And no, a school isn't off the hook legally, but then again, they often can't fix it themselves. So how do you bring in, we've had situations, even with the early ATM cases, the way the ADA is structured, you can't really go after the manufacturers, but we did bring in the ATM manufacturers to be part of the conversation. So that's one good thing about collaboration, is to say, maybe you could have a meeting with the Hoopla people. Maybe all these strategies can work with the vendors as well. In fact, they can. There's a lot of good, Microsoft has a lot of good resources, Salesforce, on how to work with vendors, how to educate the vendors. So it's not you're off the hook, but it's challenging, because a lot of times the school or the company that we're dealing with, they don't have the ability to fix it. So they have to use their convincing skills. And that's why making procurement people understand that they have to write into the contracts. Maybe next year we'll do a talk on accessible procurement, but the contracts can't just say we'll meet the ADA or we'll meet WCAG. They have to talk about roadmaps and bug fixes and testing and who's going to test and all that stuff. But then, like I said, if we're convincing a procurement team, it will make their job easier to build accessible procurement in from the outset. So good question. Another whole session.